Is good.
Cool. Hello, welcome. This works. I'm Andrej. Thanks a lot for coming around. I'm Andrej. I'm co-founder and CEO of Deepwork Studio, which is a product design studio. Over the last 2.5 years, approximately, we designed over 35 to 40 different products. And in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to show you the biggest learnings from these and introduce you to a couple of case studies and also share some tools. So we'll start off with some fundamentals on good design and what were the learnings of these platforms. Then I'll talk a little bit about how to make an experience actually delightful and interesting for your users. And at the end, I'll share some zero-cost tools to actually implement some of these strategies pretty much right away and approach design from a very efficient perspective. So before I actually go into design itself, I want you to all think about this question. And it sounds a bit odd, but this is probably the most important thing you should decide on before you start building a product. So what problem exactly are you solving? And there's a lot of opportunities with technologies that we have, but only very few of them are actually useful and useful for the users, useful for the world. So answering that question alongside with things like who are your users or what technology are you using? Why do you want to use that technology? Or why are you actually the person to be able to execute on that technology is fundamentally important to get a start into whatever you want to build. So it's almost like Simon Sinek's statement of why. Like you want to figure that out and everything else is going to emanate from there. And so once you've answered that, you can actually start with some idea that will help you create a product. And how you go from an idea to a product. So here's an example actually for Hummingbot. They started off with as a protocol, actually no real product, just like not even a real interface. So this is they started off with a command line interface, and they were solving a problem for market makers and day traders to actually create their own market making bots to automate their trades as frequently as possible. And they were a really small community on Discord, just playing around with these things and trying to build their own market makers. And first of all, what we did is kind of did a few. I'm just going to stay here. So we started off with a lot of workshops. Actually, first of all, deciding on prioritizing the challenges that the Hummingbot was facing, writing out some user journeys, sketching out wireframes together. And please don't delegate that kind of work to designers. I'm also saying that because a lot of teams do that. This is something that requires your full attention, especially if you're owning the product. So do it with people who are knowledgeable and exchange information during these workshops together. I'll also share with you how to do these things later. And so after doing that, we took 3 days for workshops and then designed an interface which looks like this, or these are parts of it. Essentially, that showed to users how that product could look, and it was great. It looks super usable. So we also actually user tested it, so we showed it to a couple of people. But what turned out at the end was that in this case, it was actually not helpful to create a graphical user interface because people were more interested in supporting more exchanges. And so based on this 1-week prototype, after user testing, Hummingbot was actually able to pivot really quickly and design something that now has become liquidity mining and emanated through the entire space of DeFi. And so that was kind of the process of workshops, and prototyping, and user testing. So once you have something that you can show to people, they will resonate with that and you'll pick up on this. And what Hummingbot also did really well, this is a schematic from a book called Crossing the Chasm. What they really did well is that they narrowed their target audience on the very, very first initial segment. And also, please don't try to go for all the users at the same time. It's super important to pay attention to the very, very niche at the very beginning, which is the innovators, at least if you're starting out. And then you're slowly going to expand the product into other areas. And you will see how people will become aware and how would they become interested. And they will also change throughout time. They will become early adopters and then majority. And so you can look that up in the book. It's a really great book. But what Hummingbot actually did in our as they designed the prototype, they were aiming with the prototype for something that was way beyond here, where they were trying to create something that's very, very user-friendly and easy to use, but they were actually still right over there at the very beginning, where people weren't really interested in being super user-friendly. And so it was really good that they actually user-tested that interface and listened to their users. For most Web3 products and DeFi products, it's actually going to look something like this. I can talk about that a bit more off that conversation, so ask me if you have any questions around that. But realistically, it's going to go something like this because Web3 is enabling marketplaces, so you will have to jump back and forth between these things quite a lot. And so once you have that, I want to suggest to you to kind of think about design as a mental model from stigmergy, from how animals, and these are like ants, create very specific trails to food and to things that they like. So they communicate to each other, build out these trails, and then based on the trails, they understand where to flock and how to expand. And with building products, it's actually very, very similar mental model. So you're not designing something and hoping that people will like it, but you're creating, or you're actually designing a product, you're putting it out there as a hypothesis, and it's almost like you're watching people flock to it. So wherever they come from, whether they're like from social media or another different platform, they come to your place, and then they come to your product, and the design part is actually kind of segregating the users you prefer from those that don't really align, sorry, that's a typo, don't really align with your intentions. So if you're building a DeFi platform that's motivated for long-term long-term holding or long-term investing, you don't want day traders on there because behavior of these people will kind of ruin the experience for the others. And so you want to, like, design work is actually about kind of creating these boundaries and solidifying the channels of where individuals walk through and get what they need from your product. And so you do that through wording, through imagery, through actual kind of experience of the interface. And so that's the way to think about design, really. And so another example of that is, for instance, SourceCred. They are a tool that quantifies feedback from Discord, discourse, and GitHub. So they count posts, likes, and relationships between individuals. They just count them and build a social graph on it. And what they realized at some point was that people expanded outside of Discord, and they started to create events or writing articles which were not really quantifiable anymore. And so designing a new interface was not about like making a better experience for the Discord users, but was actually facilitating the interface for the interaction for these other newly emerging behaviors of people trying to quantify the contributions to the community outside of Discord. So that's what they designed or ended up designing. You can also click through the prototypes, share with you later as well. And so once you're there, you might be thinking that kind of growth is the next step. So you have your community, you have a couple of people, so you want to grow. But that's another thing to pay really close attention to, because growth hacking, as it's popularized in startups, is actually a really huge fallacy. The way that your product is growing is determined by your environment. And your environment are VCs, your clients, your users, friends, and allies. They will tell you or communicate to you what exactly is required from you in order to make them really happy. And there is a limit to that. So you can't grow beyond that, because once you grow beyond it, you start pushing. But you don't want to push, because then people will also become skeptical and not use your product. So there are always these limits, and each technology actually goes through these like sigmoid curves. You can observe that with pretty much any startup. You're starting off with a concept, and you go into a sigmoid curve, and at some point it's going to flatten out. And if you don't take care of it, your project is going to die, so you'll have to re-innovate again. And so another example of that was, for instance, Molecule. From a couple of years ago, they wanted to create basically a marketplace for pharmaceutical research teams to be connected to retail investors and kind of facilitate that exchange. So they wanted to get the research teams to tokenize their IP and then get you guys to just invest in whatever pharmaceutical research you think is interesting. And they were like, okay, we're going to use blockchain, we're going to like create bonding curves, and like had these really great ideas of like layering technologies on top of technologies before releasing it. And what they realized was, so they were actually aiming for way too high. So the users, their investors, were like, what is MetaMask? So they didn't even want to interact with crypto. Their the research teams were like, we don't know what bonding curves are. We don't understand how to what we do with like our patents. We just stay safe. And the actual pharmaceutical industry was like, get the fuck out of our business, because that was going to maybe destroy it. And so they were really like aiming way too high, but they should actually be having been started really way earlier. And that's what they ended up doing. So they ended up scaling all the way down, not using any blockchain, and just like manually automating everything with, well, not auto, that's a, they did not end up automating everything. They actually ended up doing everything manually. And now they're like VitaDAO. You can follow them. It's actually quite an interesting project. So, and you might think, so it's actually, you can think of your product almost as an organism that way, that is in an environment that interacts with all the other things. And from that perspective, you're not really trying to race against the others, but you're just trying to be as unique as you can about the things that you can do really, really well. And you might think, okay, so this is like the organisms also kind of face the survival of the fittest, but it's also not precisely defined what fittest is, really. Like, okay, I mean, Darwin described it as the trend of how evolution works, but he was also keeping, he was also describing it as fitness being defined by the environment, and the environments are different. So it always really depends on what the definition of the fitness is. So is it either your product is faster than some other product, or maybe it's like you can create much higher quality, or maybe like even a mix of all of these. And so it's really, it really doesn't become a race. It's more like trying to work with everything that's surrounding you. And then one last thing before we go into kind of the light and nice kind of design. This is an example from Covalent. They were pure API. They essentially thought and knew that they are very, very similar to the graph, but probably more powerful. And that's how they kind of verbalized it for themselves. But what they ended up communicating was actually kind of the value behind it. And so saying things like they have a marketplace for API endpoints, so you can actually earn money on this. So like figuring out the things that distinguish them from the competition or from the graph, and not trying to compare themselves with. And so that way they were able to really get the attention of those who are really interested in using the kind of multi-chain data collection from their API. So now there's a couple of examples of how to make an experience really delightful, because I think it's really fun, and it's also kind of the goal that your users are actually happy with using it. And I think the very first thing that you want to, or like the number one thing that you really want to avoid, especially with DeFi, is a situation like this, because people are constantly confronted with their monetary assets and sending them through the internet. They still don't really understand where it goes. So you really need to establish kind of this notion of trust, because if people don't trust you, they're not going to be happy or even delighted. Like, it's just not part of the reality. So try to figure out how exactly to establish this trust. And there's also another example from DHedge, for instance. There's a lot of ways to do that in the interface itself. They're very, very simple to do. For DHedge, which is a synthetics hedge fund, they basically had these managers, and we pointed out exactly who these people are. We pointed out to their social media profiles, so people could do their due diligence and actually figure out what these people do, how knowledgeable they are, and also allow some comments. And I mean, you probably can't see it, but there's a comment section on the bottom. So there's actually like human interaction that you can follow through, and that's what they ended up doing. People actually kind of using that and understanding how much they can trust these individuals who might actually also make mistakes. Other things involve things like always being transparent about your smart contracts or showing smart contract audits. These things always have a really, really high kind of value in terms of trust. So a lot of times it's also enough to put them on the website or on the homepage, but it's also sometimes you can put them somewhere in the product itself. So the next thing is you actually want to create the experience. And this is something that's very interesting, because it's almost like an art. Like, creating an experience is very, very similarly structured to how that happens in movies or with comedy or with music, because you always start with making a promise on something that is very, very unique and special. And it has to be important, and people have to pay attention. And that's what you want to communicate. You're taking your users and you're getting them to the edge of a cliff and showing them what's there, and as like a magical world, and you're slowly dragging them back. And then you guide them through the experience of actually kind of interacting with your product, like clicking around, like trying to explore what's going on. Always like obviously guiding them, communicating to them exactly what they need. And then you deliver on that promise, and you give them what they want. And you give them the thing that they thought in the beginning was completely impossible. And for this one, this is beefy.finance. It's probably one of the most ridiculous examples. I don't know who of you knows it. They had ridiculous APYs, which were like, I don't know, we user tested it, and it was like 15Q% or something. It's an aggregator for yield farming, essentially. And it was like, some of them had trillion APYs, so it was like, yeah, 15Q%, and some user testers were like, that's not a number. And it was really ridiculous, but they also were able to fulfill that promise because they had a mechanism that made it work. It may be very short term, so most of these projects died really quickly, but that was what the experience was about. So we showed them like, here's the historical data, here's the project team, here are the things, like here's the risk kind of score. We came up with that. I mean, we didn't come up with the numbers, but we came up with the concept of a risk score in order to show people what are the risks if there's a APY that's just like has more numbers than you can, more digits that you can count to. And then we delivered them on the promise. So like, first of all, obviously giving them these insane APY quotes once they actually go through that, and then also showing it really prominently on the very top. So this is what you get. This is yours, at least for some amount of time. And then obviously things like the launchpad, which was quite an interesting process because people would have to dedicate, like, you know, send through several thousands of dollars into space. And you sometimes have to go through like friction points of, so in the interface we actually slowed them down so they don't click through that way too fast. So we slowed them down with saying, please read these things, you have to check these marks, and you go through this experience, and then like, you click the MetaMask, you send the money away, save your recovery phrase, and then you get rewarded by a nice image. And it seems ridiculous, but these very small things actually create a lot of experience of delight for people because they really enjoy going through this actual kind of story. And even if it's just an image that tells them that, yes, everything's fine. In this case, they ended up changing that to a rhino. You probably know Leslie the rhino, so that was the original stuff. But it's still the same concept, so it's still kind of rewarding them for the actual experience and for sticking around there. So one last thing, I think I'm also pretty much finished. What I would really like to suggest to you, and what I also keep kind of repeating quite a lot in this space, is please steal ideas from everywhere, because everything that you find important is going to help you build something that will be important for someone else. So I keep a notebook around and I'll just like write things down most of the time. We have a website where we publish all of our case studies as actual Figma files. So if you have something that you work on that's something similar, you can actually just go there, explore the Figma files, copy paste them, maybe refactor them a little bit and make it work for your own project. And it's not a bad thing to copy things as long as you kind of do the thinking part too and like refactor it into something that you think is important. And that way you'll collect things like get inspired by movies, by other products, by trees, by books, by poems, anything. And again, anything that really resonates with you, even funny things, it really creates a unique experience for other people that they haven't seen before and that they will enjoy for a long time. That's it. Thank you so much. Oh wait, sorry, actually one last thing I forgot. The tool. So this is a QR code. Our website is deepwork.studio, but you can scan that thing. And we open source everything. So we have a knowledge base for all the processes. So all the workshops that I mentioned before and more, we have it on knowledge base. We basically have a documentation on how all the individuals and designers work. Yes, perfect. Or ask me, it doesn't work? Okay, for someone it didn't work, just... Awesome, okay. Well, type in... we put up a new website recently. So type in deepwork.studio. Cool, okay, yeah. Great job, Andrej. We'll type in deepwork. Yeah, looks nicer than the URL. But yeah, type deepwork.studio. Apologies for that. Next time will be better. But if you go on the website, there's a knowledge base, which is like a Git book of all the processes that we do. So all of these processes, our designers follow step by step. So they're very, very granular. So even if you just want to kind of learn how to do user research or something, you can find example interview guides. You can find reports. You can find the prototypes themselves. You can find basically an individual, like a complete guide to how to design something from start to finish. There are case studies as well. Look through them. We don't do them to show off the work. We do them in order to share the actual files. So we never work with teams who want to sign an NDA with us, because all the design work should be accessible to everyone, and you should be able to steal the ideas and copy them and make them yours. And also, if you want, there's also a link. If you're actually interested in design or interested in kind of shadowing actual active projects, you can join our Discord and observe how these projects actually work in real time. You can shadow on them. You can also contribute and buddy up with an expert designer and do some work and learn from that. So that's it. Thank you so much for your interest and opinion. Yeah, thank you so much for your interest in product design. And I wish you to build the best products ever. You're great. If you have any questions, I'm sticking around here for like the next, I don't know, outside there maybe, because there's another person coming to speak.
We have time for one question.
Cool. Okay, yeah, sure.
One or two, yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Does anyone want to ask? Okay. All right, okay. Yeah, okay. Maybe you are first. Or okay, you got the mic.
So I liked your graph with the early adopters, and so I'm just curious, like, where from your perspective and your experience with interviews and stuff, is it still too early to try to get quote non-Web3 people to actually get onto?
So it depends on your product, but on average, I would say, well, again, it depends on your product and what your target audience is. So there are projects that are actually building a Web3 infrastructure, but they're targeting, but they don't need people to interact with it. So they would always almost have their own team that does the MetaMask transactions and stuff. But the actual users are then Web2 people for whom it looks like a website. It's no difference. If that is possible, yes. If you expect people to interact with transactions, probably not. At least not yet. But again, it depends. But also happy to hear what you're building on, so I can probably give you a bit better answer that way. Cool. Okay. Anyone else? Questions? This guy wanted... Okay, cool. Nice. Yeah, thanks so much then. And enjoy your day.